Joining me now, Democratic strategist and former advisor to the Obama campaign, Amisha Cross, and MSNBC political analyst Brendan Buck, who previously served as press secretary to former VP candidate Paul Ryan. Good to have you guys back. We're making a habit of this. Amisha, with these poll numbers showing a tight race no matter what, how do you gauge the risk factor of changing the ticket now? Has the president over these last few days, has he bolstered his case to stay? Because he also has quite a few events planned this week.
I think the president has ultimately showcased that not only is he not leaving the ticket, but he's the one best served to actually compete against and dominate Donald J. Trump come November. We know that his campaign is putting a very high quotient as it relates to getting on the campaign trail in these battleground states. I think that the event he held just last night in Detroit was huge. We heard the chants; they were resounding of "Don't quit." And all of the people there, specifically those who are representing unions, specifically those who are representatives of the Black community, those who are representatives of the brown community, those who feel the impetus here of why it's so important. Joe Biden is carrying the weight of the world on him right now. We're talking about all eyes being on him, but also the fate of our democracy being on him. The fate of not only the United States democracy, but the protection of democracies abroad. The legacy that this president has in terms of job creation, in terms of fighting for civil rights and equity across this country, in terms of reducing student loan debt, fighting against Project 2025 in real time, and the forcefulness he was able to exhibit last night. I think that those things are going to continue out throughout this campaign trail. We know in the coming week he's going to be in Vegas for the NAACP conference. This is a president who understands what's at stake for multiple communities across this country, specifically vulnerable communities, and those communities understand it as well.
Yeah. You know, Brendan, Amisha brings up a good point there, and she talks about the forcefulness with which he delivered the rally yesterday in Detroit. You look at the vast breadth of knowledge that he displayed on Thursday night after the NATO summit. I mean, he was in the Senate for 36 years, chair of the Foreign Relations Committee. He showed he has a level of context and perspective on that that is pretty extraordinary. Does that at all change the dynamic that we were discussing last weekend?
Not a ton. I mean, I think that the press conference this week was objectively okay. I mean, it was not an impressive performance. He definitely did better than he did in the debate, and it probably left Democrats searching a little bit. He clearly didn't fall on his face, and they can't clearly just, yank him right now. But there's still a lot of people in the House and Senate who are all getting back their own polls in their own districts right now and are probably seeing him underwater, polling underwater with more people disapproving, and it's scaring them. Now, look, the race is close. You just showed polls. Mm-hmm. Nobody can look at these polls and say these numbers are so bad that he must leave. I think what people are concerned about is, does he have the capacity to do the things necessary to make up the little ground that he has in the important swing states? Now, the conventional wisdom is he needs to get out there more. He needs to do some earned media. He needs to, talk to voters. I actually disagree with that. I don't think that's actually going to work. I think what he did last night is exactly what he needs to be doing, which is stay on teleprompter, read a really good teleprompter speech, have some good crowds that'll cheer for you, and try to move past this and just get your party up together with you. And return the focus to Donald Trump. That is the path ahead. He's not going to win by convincing people that he's not actually that old. I think he just needs to change the conversation, and maybe Democrats will get this out of their system enough over the last few weeks if they can finally do that.
Yeah, interesting point you make there. Let me ask you, Brendan, about the Bernie Sanders op-ed, though, because he says Mr. Biden may not be the ideal candidate, but he will be the candidate and should be the candidate. And with an effective campaign, that speaks to the needs of working families. He will not only defeat Mr. Trump, but beat him badly. How significant is this, given Sanders' prominence as a progressive?
Yeah, it's been interesting. You would expect, perhaps, that progressives, maybe the squad in the House, would be the ones pushing him out the most, but that has definitely not been the case. What you're seeing, I think, a lot more of the moderate, the swing voters who potentially their own districts are at risk. But I think this is a huge lifeline for him. And what it really comes down to at this point is not ideology. It's whether or not you believe Joe Biden that he's not stepping away. If you believe him that he's in this until the end, that is the obvious right thing to do. Circle the wagons, go forward, return focus to Donald Trump. Now, obviously, Bernie Sanders is asking for a little more than return to focus. That op-ed also suggests that Biden should be running on some pretty progressive, expansive ideas that probably are not very popular, but that's very Bernie Sanders. But I think what Sanders realized is, look, we're hurting our own nominee. Every day we're out here doing this, we are hurting him. And if he's not going to go, we need to get our act together and move forward against Donald Trump.
You know, Amisha, Senator Sanders said Americans should learn a lesson from progressive and centrist voters in France who came together to defeat the far-right party. Now, unlike France, Americans do not get a first round of voting to scare them into going to the polls. But is there a lesson there?
I think there's definitely a lesson there. We saw it in France. We saw it in the UK. I think it's very important to understand what an authoritarian slide looks like, what it looks like to have very far right policies that not only shutter the working class, but also make it extremely hard for a nation to continue to be competitive. And I think that these are lessons that we can take not only from Europe, but also in understanding, again, what is at stake? What is at stake home and abroad? They understood it, and they were able to give resounding victories to their more left-leaning flank. Here, Bernie Sanders does what I think was necessary. When people think of Bernie Sanders, when they think of AOC, when they think of a little bit more of the far left, what they consider the socialist wing of the party, they think of people who are fighting against the Democratic Party, consider them sometimes outsiders. That is not the case. What we're seeing is that, yes, you may not always agree on certain levels of progressivism, but even within that flank, you have to understand what is at stake and what could be taken away. And I think that within that op-ed, what we saw was Senator Sanders be able to lay it bare that him and Biden don't agree on all things. They don't see all things similarly. But we see the pathway to America's future, and we understand what is at threat with the Donald J. Trump presidency. And that's what matters the most. We need to circle the wagons. Democrats need to get on board. We need to stop acting like this is a bachelorette-style presidency where everybody gets a rose and we're going to see who's standing last. That's not what this is. Joe Biden has shown that he is in this to win it, and he's not going anywhere. It's time Democrats understand that as well.
And then, Amisha, there was this written by Tim Alberta in The Atlantic that the Trump campaign has been very optimistic about running against Biden, but does not have much of a plan if it's somebody else. And he says, quote, privately, they are all praying that he remains their opponent. We also haven't seen congressional Republicans taking this opportunity to slam Biden. So if they are hoping he stays in, does that signal that he shouldn't?
Absolutely not. I think that Republicans are playing a little bit of reverse psychology here. They've become a lot smarter, at least Trump's campaign has become a lot smarter this go round than they were 4 years ago. But with that being said, I think that it would unleash an onslaught of not only sexism, but racism to the lengths we have not seen in modern history against Kamala Harris, who would be honestly the only person who could take up this seat if it was not Joe Biden. But in addition to that, there would also have to be a rapid restructure for Democrats. Let's be real here. There's a calendar and there are rules. There would not be anyone else who is chosen whose name isn't Kamala Harris. But with that being said, a lot of the apparatus would have to change immediately. And within the time frame that we currently have, that is much too short, I believe, to be able to lodge something that is successful. And again, we know at this point that the only person who's running one against Donald Trump is Joe Biden. Go with your winning horse.
Right. And so, Brendan, real quickly, with the New York Times editorial board, their piece on Thursday, Donald Trump is unfit to lead. How can Democrats harness that as their message going forward?
Yeah, I mean, the editorial, I think, is funny in itself. There's this wing of the Democratic Party that seems to think that all of the problem with Joe Biden is that people are not critical enough of Donald Trump. At the same time, if Joe Biden can create a bit of an enemy, put a little chip on his shoulder, that people are out to get him and take up that sort of populist message that Donald Trump has used actually quite successfully, I think he could use it to his advantage. Look, I really do believe that once people get this sort of out of their system in the Democratic Party, they will be able to return focus to Donald Trump. Joe Biden is very clearly an underdog. I expect him today to lose if we were going ahead and I had to bet. But Donald Trump is very beatable. He is one of the most flawed candidates we have ever seen run for president. And if the conversation is about him, Joe Biden has a fighting chance. He just needs to get it away from his age and on to Donald Trump. Okay. Brendan Buck, Amisha Cross, good to see you both.
Hey there, MSNBC fans. I'm Luke Russert, and be sure to join me, Rachel Maddow, Jen Psaki, Lawrence O'Donnell, Steve Kornacki, Joy Reid, and many more September 7th in Brooklyn, MSNBC Live Democracy 2024. Click on the link for ticket information. We will see you there.